Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where I take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of Big Finish audio dramas, 7 days a week, one episode a day. And today, on the 26th of June 2018, we are starting the first of what's eventually going to be two actual radio dramas produced in the 1990s with John Pertwee's Doctor, Liz Sladen, and Nick Courtney as the Brigadier. Yeah, you had characters returning to their roles, something that I've always found interesting. And today we are starting with The Paradise of Death, which was written, of course, by Barry Letts, directed for BBC Radio with music by Peter Howell, of all people. The guy who who's probably most famous for doing quite a lot of music in the early John Nathan Turner era, and doing the arrangement of the theme, the second Tom Baker arrangement of the theme, and of course the Davison or first Colin Baker arrangement of the theme. All the same arrangement. It's all one arrangement. And that shows because that's actually the arrangement they used to open this story, which is a little odd, considering it's not exactly the most famous arrangement of the theme. It's also not period accurate. So it's just one of those weird decisions that they make. Like, why of all the versions of the theme that you've got, why choose that one? Why not go with the Pertwee Tom Baker theme that would have served extremely well? It would have been the theme to go with, not a random, not just the random. We're doing Davison's theme. But other than that, you have an interesting story. Well, let's be honest. First off, John Pertwee's performance, he's very obviously aged, but he does a really good job with basically, he does a really good job, doing that aged character sort of thing. Not mainly because he has worked at it quite a bit, and he does a really good job as the Doctor, giving back that magic and intrigue of his Doctor over 20 years after he left the role. I'm pretty sure it was 20 years after he left the role. And this is one that I really like for that. Like, Pertwee does an amazing job. Oddly enough, this is also, they've got a pretty star-studded guest cast. They have Peter Miles, who he was in Doctor Who and the Silurians, and then later Invasion of the Dinosaurs. So this is it'll be interesting because in chronology, this is like after this one, story is Invasion of the Dinosaurs, which is the one where Peter Miles also plays a character. So that's kind of interesting. You also have Toby Longworth, who's a pretty big British radio star. He's been in quite a few things, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, quite a lot of Big Finish stuff. And we have an interesting idea. We have an evil amusement park where, well, the Doctor seems to think that the quote-unquote aliens that are supposedly just people in costumes might actually be aliens. That's really all the intrigue we have. Barry Letts kind of writes a simple plot for the first episode, for the first part of this story at least. Like, he's not too big on giving us a big final awesome story. He's just like, yeah, we're taking this slow and we're gonna be working at it, but it's gonna be something that really the story kind of has to work at. It's one where the story is like, okay, we've got this story as it stands right now. Like, this is where we're going with it. So let's take it and let's take it in some new directions. And those are interesting enough new directions. Like, you have the Doctor there to be interested in things. Like, you have this, you have the Doctor as a character. Like, you don't just have the story ending with like the episode, and you have the characters being characters, and they're all pretty good at that. They're all the characters are solid. The story really does feel like a good, solid beginning to things, mainly in that regard. In the regard of that, it's a decently derived story for quite a few reasons. Because of that, it's also just a story where everything, it's a really good starter. I just wish we just sort of got a little more of that goodness, you could say. Like, you have the problem with the fact that not much could be said about the story other than that. Yeah, we're starting it. It's not really making a complete story. So I'm going to give Doctor Who: The Paradise of Death Part 1 an 8 out of 10 because it's a very solid beginning. It does very well on audio, and I can see it being very well on radio. It doesn't quite introduce enough to, like, it's more Hartnell-esque than a Pertwee story, which isn't a good thing. Alright, it is the 27th of June 2018, and I just finished listening to Part 2 of The Paradise of Death. And Part 2 of The Paradise of Death is just as good as Part 1. We get a little more explanation of the story. See, a lot of the story is, oddly enough, it's doing an interesting sort of futuristic-y type story, mainly with the fact that it's sort of set not quite in the future. Like, it's set for the most part on Earth. At least these first two episodes were. We actually leave Earth as the cliffhanger, and we get actually transported into a war zone. But it's actually dealing with, like, the ideas of virtual reality, which was something very 90s. I think it's interesting that they're doing it, though they're doing this whole virtual reality plot line with a cast from the 70s. It's not a cast from the 90s, it's a 70s cast. And with that, you get some really interesting sort of ideas going around. Like, you have the Doctor and Sarah Jane, the Doctor and the Brig, essentially given a plot where they have to be they're sort of outside of time. They're sort of, even though they're in the 70s, it's a very interesting. I find it to be a very interesting sort of episode with that. Not bad per se, but a good, interesting idea, even if it doesn't really do much with the idea. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot to be said about the story, as it's like, hey, we're doing this, it's a rather weird sort of thing, and we're not doing a full story. Like, it's just very weird with what they're doing, and, well, how they're doing it. It's not a full 100% story. It's a very, we're doing this slow, and we're taking it slow and letting everything come out naturally. Because there are 5 episodes to fill. This is a story with 5 full episodes. But the virtual reality idea is nice. And what's interesting is that the aliens, I think they're called Paracons, or they're from Paracos, basically, which is supposed to be like a paradise world, which is funny because we end with a war zone, and not an actual, it's not actually one of those, everything's happy. It's interesting that way, but it doesn't quite continue to be the full story. Like, it's a story that really doesn't complete itself. Like, we get off. We're moving away from this. I haven't mentioned the character of Jeremy Fitzoliver, who is Sarah Jane's cousin and a photographer, and he's played by Richard Pearson. Richard Pearce does an okay job, but it's not. He's not a very good character. He's just sort of there. So yeah, I am going. I'm going to what's also interesting is that this story is again placed in between Time Warrior and Invasion of the Dinosaurs, which is funny because there really shouldn't be a gap there, but they just make one. It's a good episode. We move off. We see like that all the aliens at this space world is actually they're actually holograms of real aliens, in what's called experienced reality. And it's playing with some interesting ideas like Barry Letts does a lot, but and it's a really good episode. It keeps your attention. It just doesn't quite. It just isn't a fully formed story quite as of yet. So I'm going to give The Paradise of Death, Part 2, an 8 out of 10, just like the first one. Because again, we're solid conclusion, but we just aren't quite hitting everything perfect like you should. Alright, it is the 28th of June, 2018, and I just finished listening to Part 3 of The Paradise of Death. And Part 3 of The Paradise of Death is a bit of a step down from the first two parts, mainly because this is the very middle episode, but it's also the episode where the plot gets going. Like, we have Peter Miles' character, who I don't quite remember any of the characters' names. That's one of my big gripes with this, is that the characters' names aren't quite memorable. But other than that, you have Peter Miles' character, and I think that's the character from Morris Denham, basically framing this guy in Paracon for having terrorist sympathies, and also a way to try to get the doctor, Sarah Jane and the Brigadier, and I guess Jeremy, who is Jeremy Fitzoliver sort of takes the role of the companion here. Like, he gets the, I'm asking the dumb questions. I don't really like him as a character. I full disclosure, I read the Ghost of N Space book before this, and so that was my first exposure to him, and he is just as bad here. He isn't any better in the performance. I don't even really think the guy who plays him is that good of an actor, in my opinion. He's just well, kind of an annoying character overall. Like, he's like, yes, I am important, and I am important to the plot. Also, what I find weird about the structure is that it's kind of difficult to get back into episodes because they don't actually reprise the cliffhangers, and the opening title is just cut off. Also, for whatever reason, Part 3 is split over the two discs. Like, I had to stop Disc 1 and insert Disc 2 before Part 3 was over. Like, that is just a little on the completely weird side for me. Like, really, why would you do that? It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't work well when you got two discs like that. It would work better if it was just like all over the course of one disc, and that one disc was what we watched, because it's not. The two discs isn't necessary. I do have some good things to say, though. Again, John Pertwee and Liz Sladen and Nick Courtney all blow it out of the water. I like that the breeder actually gets to go into space and see an alien planet for once. Like, it's actually really quite cool. And I quite like that this is trying to do... one of my big complaints is it's trying to do a political message, but it's not doing it quite well. It's doing the whole too much TV is evil message, which is kind of funny considering this is based off of a TV show, and, a TV show with, at this point, when this was made, a lot of content, including a bunch of novels. Like, this isn't the best message to go with Barry, because Barry Letts wrote this. Like, you have, like, but there's also, like, a lot of TV is violent and dumb, like this does a lot of the Vengeance on Varos gambit, where the Society of Paracon a lot of people are unemployed, but they're happily unemployed. This is sort of a critique yet defense of capitalism. It's a very complex sort of message that I don't think Barry Letts handles quite as well as he could. He's basically like, yeah, but it leaves some people unemployed, even though they're happily unemployed and they're sitting being an idiot. It's sort of like, why not work? Which is kind of a bit Marxist, I guess, but it doesn't quite come across that way. It's very weird. And, like, there's this whole market for death games. Like, they take terrorists and they just put them in a killing game. And oddly enough, Sarah Jane sort of calls them out for their, like, because it's sort of a, pardon my speciesism, I guess, human rights violation with that. Like, because it's not like they're people, but they're intelligent beings. They still probably have a right to be treated humanely, not be hunted for sport and entertainment. Like, it's kind of like the Hunger Games, but in Battle Royale, but like in the mid-90s. Well, in the early 90s, actually, 'cause 1993 or 1994. This was around the 30th anniversary of the show. And he does a lot of interest, like this story just has a lot of interesting stuff, and in it just doesn't quite capitalize on it very well. It's like, oh, we have an interesting idea that we're going to be playing with, but don't get too comfortable, because after that, because, we're going to introduce it, and then we're just going to cut to something else, because why try to keep you guys interested when we could just be cutting away to something different? Also, like, I guess the plan is to take over Earth. Like, well, it's not quite explained as to why they're on Earth, but you know what? It's still an overall enjoyable episode. Like, the music work is good. A lot of the acting is good. It's got a stellar cast and a decent enough adventure that you don't really think of the plot holes while you're listening to it. It's just afterwards where they start to creep in. So I'm going to give Paradise of Death Part 3 a 7 out of 10. All right, it is still the 28th of June 2018, and I just finished listening to Part 4 of The Paradise of Death. And this one, it falls into that trap that a lot of Doctor Who stories fall into, where it's like, hey, we're at the penultimate episode, but we don't quite have enough material to stretch it out. Like, why? And this is puzzling for this one, because you could easily have done this as 5 episodes. I mean, there's some interesting stuff here. You have people, you have a lot of the natives of Paracon revealed to be sort of interesting tribesmen. Like, this story is trying to do a lot of, like, messages. Like, it's almost like it's trying to go to a different message per episode, and it doesn't. It's almost too full of messages. Like, it doesn't work like that. You need to slow down and be like, all right, we're going to do this message, and we're going to stick to it, and that's going to be it. We can focus on this thing. It's spreading itself too thin as a story. It's not like, yeah, we've got this great story, everything's perfect about it, nothing's going to go wrong, but we're at the next message, and that doesn't work. So, we got to keep going. We got to find something new to talk about and try to have as a part of our story. Not like if we were just going on, like, it's a very difficult to get into Part 4, because, well, it's not telling a story. It's just like, we're doing a message and we aren't, and the message isn't, and it isn't getting through. That's that's a big part of why this story overall just doesn't quite work well. Like, it deals with, it's dealing with the whole plot on Paracon, and you have the idea that, like, it's only these two people. Like, Barry Letts tries to write the aliens as, like, a full race, like, not fully evil, just a couple of them are evil, because that makes sense, even if the sense it makes even if the sense it makes isn't entirely correct. It's one that just, the story is just like, we don't know what we want to be. It's something that it's really trying to get everything done, and it also has the problem of just not being able to really do some good stuff. Like, it's I mean, basically the episode itself devolves so that the Doctor is forced into playing a game. And if I'm going to be brutally honest, as a story,
as an episode, this episode is just sort of where it lost me a bit, like, with the plot. Like, I'm not quite sure where everything's going. Like, again, the plan of the villains doesn't make much sense. Like, it's a decent episode. It's still a little confusing. So I'm going to give Paradise of Death Part 4 a 6 out of 10. Alright, it is the 29th of June, 2018, and I just finished listening to Part 5 of The Paradise of Death. And Part 5 of The Paradise of Death is honestly a really solid conclusion for the story. Much better than what Part 4 was, mainly because Part 4 was kind of on the just slightly above average side. But yeah, Part 5 is actually a really good thing. It's mainly an action one, and an action episode, and I think that probably one of the best one of the best parts one of the best parts of this story one of the best parts of this story is that, well, is that it actually it ends really decently. Like it's a really solid conclusion to the story. It's one of those things where the story really really does a good job of concluding. It's a big fight scene. I mean, yeah, it's kind of narrated like a lot, but as a story, the narration really doesn't cause a lot of problems. It's generally just, it's Sarah Jane giving the narration, which is a really solid way of doing it. Like, I really like that. It's a really good sort of solid ending for the story, and it gives us a real sense of conclusion. So I'm going to give Paradise of Death episode Part 5 a 7 out of 10, because it's just one big fight scene, and then everything's done, and all the wrongs are righted, and we are finished with it. So yeah. And we average up the scores to give The Paradise of Death a final score of 7.2 out of 10. Thank you everybody for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time when we go back to television stories with Invasion of the Dinosaurs.